Welcome everybody to the second panel, which is called Genre and the Transnational Influence of Italian Giallo. I'm from Italy. I'm here in Latina near Rome, so I'm particularly thrilled to be chairing a panel about Italian Giallo. The first paper is by Ted Silva. Ted is a graduate student in the Film and Television Studies program at Boston University. His thesis, Sighs from the Depths, Rendering Trauma and National History in Italian Horror Cinema, examines the history of fascist control over the Italian cinema and the development of distinct cinematic horror movements that comment on the collective trauma cast over the nation. The paper is called Through a Killer's Eyes, First-Person Perspective and Audience Implication in Peeping Tom and Profondo Rosso. Please, Ted.
Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Let me just share my screen so that we can get the... Okay, cool. Oops. Sorry, everyone. Okay. So as with any genre or genre offshoot, the slasher film carries with it a set of expectations, generic ingredients that either align a given text with others in the larger corpus or subvert the very notions that formulate the corpus in the first place. With a slasher film, audiences enter expecting a central assailant, often a distinctive murder weapon, some form of blade, and a collection of victims who are all disposed of in increasingly grotesque and elaborate fashion. But it can be argued that these murders and even the anonymous expendability of the victims are some of the central appeals of the slasher film. But beyond the base perverse pleasures that we derive from that requisite carnage, however, one of the defining elements of many of these texts is the intrigue surrounding the killer. Oftentimes, the identity and motives of the cinematic killers are shrouded in mystery so as to preserve narrative tension and provide their targets with an objective outside of survival. Find out who the killer is, identify them, and what's their purpose. But through this ambiguity, the killer becomes the central locus of audience investment, no matter how enigmatic their presence. The slasher film regularly obfuscates the identity of the central assailant and disrupts the audience's sympathetic association with the figures on screen through its use of the first-person perspective shot. This device can be traced back to Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, often cited as the foundational slasher film, and its use of the camera's lens as both the entry point for the viewer's subjective association with the killer's perspective and the weapon through which the killer enacts violence. It is equally prevalent in the Italian Giallo, often cited as a forebear to the modern slasher subgenre. Dario Argento's Profondo Rosso, or Deep Red, epitomizes this prevalence, as the film sequences of violence often rapidly shift between the first-person point of view shots of the killer during both the preparation for the attack and the assault itself, wherein it switches from the perspective of the victim and the killer. Through close analysis of both texts, I will contend that the use of perspective shots in slasher films and the slasher-adjacent giallo confront the passive nature of cinema spectatorship and implicates the audience as a bystander by forcing them to identify with the perspective of the cinematic killer. So, Peeping Tom represented a startling departure from the rest of Powell's oeuvre. His directorial contributions with Emmerich Pressburger vacillated from the monochrome seaside romance of I Know Where I'm Going, pictured in the top left, the heavenly humanist fantasy of A Matter of Life and Death, top right, and the darkly intoxicating technicolor melodrama of Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes, respectively, on the bottom left and the bottom right. Peeping Tom's lurid intermingling of sexual deviance with violent behavior alienated critics. So aghast was one critic by Peeping Tom's content that he likened Powell to the Marquis de Sade, according to John Hamilton. It is worth addressing that the aggrieved contemporaneous responses to Powell's film explicitly made note of its unique framing of the violence in relation to the audience. The original case study of the film's classification from the British Board of Film Censors points out that the critics were revulsed by the film's, quote, implication that there is something sinister in the act of filming, through positioning a camera as a murder weapon and visualizing the killer's perspective through the camera lens. The film shows the audience that specific violent gaze and thus creates association with a murderer or an assailant's subjectivity. The report also cites specific moments of particularly graphic sexuality or violence that were cut from the film in order to attain the original X rating. But the film's suggestion of violence, of audience complicity due to the passive nature of cinema spectatorship, incensed viewers from the film's original release. So, in the opening scene, Mark conceals his camera under his pea coat. He's covertly recording his encounter with a sex worker. This is framed through the camera's lens, and its malevolence is further signaled by crosshairs forming a leering target on Mark's unwitting victim. The camera assumes Mark's predatory gaze in the first person, ogling the woman's behind and stalking her up to the room where she will be killed. The initial solicitation, Mark's chase, the slow removal of her clothing, and her realization of the grave danger she is in are all framed through Mark's camera, functioning as the audience's eyes into the sequence. What we later learn is that Mark's predilection towards filming his victims as he kills them with a spike mounted onto the camera's stand is the product of a sexual fetish known as scopophilia, or as Virginie Silva puts it, the morbid urge to gaze. So many have noted the reflexive nature of depicting a scopophilic gaze on screen, but Peeping Tom really is the apotheosis of this trend. Silva writes that the film invites analysis of Mark's disorder as a reflective metaphor on the voyeuristic nature of the act of cinema spectatorship itself, particularly as it relates to viewing vulnerable human bodies in states of agony or ecstasy. Through not only adopting the ocular properties of the camera lens, but also its movements and its behaviors, as you can see in the clip. There's the shaking as the camera walks, but also the looking up, looking down, resembling Mark's glances and tracking the sex worker's movements. Powell's film forces the audience to embody Mark's perception and experience his objectification through his violent gaze. Now, the camera's diegetic presence in the film renders the metaphor far more explicit. But Peeping Tom set a tradition of embodied perception that later horror films would follow, subvert, add their own flavor to. Though later slasher and slasher-adjacent texts do not explicitly acknowledge the presence of the camera in the audience, the precedent set by Peeping Tom established a cinematic language wherein the camera lens and the perspective of the killer become one. Oops. So, one of the most distinctive offshoots of the slasher tradition as founded by Peeping Tom is the Italian Giallo film, inspired by the Italian translations of early to mid-century American crime novels published by Italian publishing house Mondadori with famous yellow covers. Gialli are characterized by lurid portrayals of violence and sexuality, often interlinked, and typified by tropes such as an anonymous killer and a citizen witness to the killer's violence who assumes the role of an amateur detective to identify the identity of said killer. Many of these texts share ingredients with one another and often wear their references on their sleeves. Gialli bring new texture and intensity to these established conventions. Perhaps one of the most influential and innovative Giallo filmmakers is Dario Argento, whose film The Bird with the Crystal Plumage brought the Giallo to a new level of popularity and acclaim. But perhaps his most acclaimed and influential Giallo is Profondo Rosso, or Deep Red, not only due to its labyrinthian plot, but also because of its unique and abrasive stylization, which signaled a hallmark for the rest of Italian horror going forward. Profondo Rosso resembled a new destabilizing extreme for the Giallo and the horror film at large. Profondo Rosso demonstrates Argento's hyperkinetic style of abrasion. The camera swoops around sequences. The editing rapidly cuts between different character subjectivities as the progressive rock score by Goblin shrieks, and the violence is elaborately staged such that each blow is felt with the utmost viscerality, and the body of the victim is framed in the most expressionistic and theatrical way possible. I argue that the synthesis of these extreme, sometimes disjunctive aesthetics serves as an intentional alienation technique meant to destabilize the viewer's comfort and spectatorship. The result is quite assaultive to the viewer, but the function is twofold. While Peeping Tom explicitly emphasized the cinematic apparatus and its diegesis and the presence of the viewer through the first-person lens of a camera, Profondo Rosso maximalist approach to cinematic language of cinematography, editing, music, and scenic design approximate a similar concept, just with a larger vocabulary. The perspective shots in Profondo Rosso vacillate between clearly first-person shots from the eyes of an assailant, as well as a seemingly disembodied point of view. In an early scene, the camera swoops through the lobby of a massive auditorium before entering the theater to reveal a conference delivered by Helga, a German psychic medium. That the camera represents a malevolent presence is signified by the simple action of the curtain swooping open as the camera passes through, as though the operator of the camera pulled the curtains themselves. When Helga halts the conference because she can feel the, quote, twisted, perverted, murderous thoughts of someone in the audience, the sequence returns to being shot from that previous, seemingly disembodied perspective as the unseen figure behind the camera slowly ambles through the audience, leaving the auditorium. This is filtered through the perspective of the unseen figure behind the camera, and thus takes on and assumes their behavioral movements. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a clip of that sequence to embed in my presentation, but though we as viewers are seemingly omnipresent in the world of the film, we are given access to Helga's fear by seeing her response to the sensation she's experiencing up close. Argento more directly associates us with the threat, confronting the malevolent nature of our spectatorial presence, as though we are the ones operating the camera. We are the ones whose thoughts she is feeling. This becomes far more apparent when later on, Helga senses a similar threat outside the door of her apartment, and an intruder breaks into her apartment and violently murders her. Marshall Landy discusses Argento's interest in showing violence acts for what they are. They're cruel, barbaric, and nonsensical. To achieve this effect, Argento imbues his most violent sequences with jarring visuals, extremely quick cuts, and abrasive sounds that shake the viewer's perception of the film's reality, all while delivering grotesque images of trauma inflicted upon human bodies. She argues that in Argento's films, quote, blurring of fact and fantasy, challenges to representation, hallucinatory quality, and particular strategies to incorporate the viewer into their images, they address a world where the real and illusory have lost their clarity and where art is as dangerous as life. The approach thus reflects the nature of film violence in multiple ways. First, the sheer viscerality of the violence forces the viewer to contend with their consumption of explicit portrayals of human destruction. Second, the sequence's abrasive stylization wields the cinematic vocabulary to its maximum abilities, thus forcing the viewer to reflect on how the cinematic apparatus can document, filter, and frame violence to an audience that consumes it. Finally, the viewer contends with themselves as spectators and willful participants in what has become an ongoing perpetuation of violence. So before we get to the actual murder scene, Argento implies audience complicity by using perspective shots that show the process of the murderer readying themselves for the assault. Though these shots are not clearly in the first person, at least not to the degree that they are in Peeping Tom, the use of the eye camera implies the perspective of the killer, especially as they look at their own blades and as they apply the makeup to their eyes. Though, of course, this shot is not through their eyes. The close proximity to their process and to their body, as we can see them, performing the task of applying the eye makeup, we see their eye in intense, discomforting close-up. It brings us close to them. So even if we are not explicitly seeing through their eyes, we are with them, as though we are accomplices, as though we are even helping them apply the makeup themselves. The precision with which Argento shows us the killer choosing the murder weapon, applying the shadow, and donning black leather gloves, which is a common staple of Giallo iconography, replicates the detail of the killer's preparation, and we become a part of it. The murderer's premeditation becomes ours too. A similar effect can be found in the aforementioned scene from Peeping Tom. As we saw before, the slow build, the ominous presence of the camera, and the leering gaze as Mark follows the sex worker into the apartment. We already understand through the objectification of the gaze Mark's intent to murder the sex worker. Through our presence in this insidious sequence of preparation with weapons and strange dolls and the donning of eye makeup, we become one with the killer's preparation to commit murder. So unlike the Peeping Tom sequence, which contains a far slower build, I'm just going to fast forward a bit, which contains a slower build to a violent crescendo in one flowing first-person perspective shot, Profondo Rosso features a far more propulsive language. Within split seconds after the killer kicks in the door, Argento cuts multiple times in rapid succession to angles of the killer's hatchet in the air, suddenly plunging into Helga's chest in extreme close-up. Argento repeats this trick as he alternates between frenzied, nearly out-of-focus close-ups of Helga's anguished face. Though the scene does not maintain one consistent first-person perspective shot like Peeping Tom, the rapid fluctuations between the killer and Helga's subjectivities ultimately serve the same goal. While the slow, ogling perspective shot of Mark's camera in Peeping Tom forces the audience to partake in his objectification and look through his fetishistic gaze, the rapidly shifting subjectivities in the deep red scene force us to understand the frenzy, the adrenaline of both experiencing the victim's assault and perpetuating it. And there we see Argento's penchant for the theatrical staging and the excessive final blow against the victim's body. So the slow ogling perspective from Mark's camera forces the audience to partake in his objectification and look through his fetishistic gaze. So though we are repulsed by Mark, the film is daring us to see and quite plainly look at what is turning him on and experience his objectification of the female body and basically partake in his fetish. So if Peeping Tom is approaching that transgressive eroticism, Profondo Rosso is rendering sort of the frenzy and the frenzy and the fear and adrenaline and an intense bloody rush of violence. Carl Shinova writes that Gialli, quote, nevertheless provoke a political thinking by way of confronting their viewer through a reformation of that viewer's perspective on the physicality of that world vis-a-vis a kind of aesthetic agitation. Argento's rapid cuts between what Helga sees, the hatchet swinging down, the killer's shoes stepping towards her, and what the killer sees, which is a frantic, wounded Helga desperately crawling away to no avail, place the audience in an agitated, destabilized subjectivity. Argento shows us what it is to be the assaulter and to be the assaulted. And though the camera may not be the physical diegetic presence in the world of the scene as it is in Peeping Tom, its constant adoption of both Helga and the killer's perspective, along with the supplemental effects of the disjunctive editing, Goblin's pulsing score, and the expressionistic scenic design, it all supplements the sensorial effect that Argento is striving for. As cinematic spectators, we view the events on screen from a distance. No matter how much the content reaches us and seemingly bridges the gap, the cinema screen and the camera lens are prisms through which we enter the world of the film. But the barrier still exists. The comfort in looking safely from beyond that barrier resembles the power that the cinematic killer has over their victim. When we watch, unable to intervene, we too stand above the victim with the killer. If Powell is addressing the phenomenon and confronting the apparatus that allows it, Argento is confronting it head on and is forcing the viewer to reckon with the implications of this dynamic by approximating the true hysteria of a murder, the fear of the victim, and the truth of what it means to be on the giving and receiving end of the killing blow. So in conclusion, Peeping Tom and Profondo Rosso acknowledge the presence of the audience as distanced spectatorial viewers through the use of first-person perspective shots and other forms of perspective shots. And both films are intimately and sensorial capturing the fear that the presence of the killer and the audience instills in the victim, thus implicating the viewer as an accomplice to the violence. In further research, I'm interested in finding more connective tissue between Powell's work and trying to establish a clearer timeline between Peeping Tom and the rise of the Giallo, and trying to get some more, more awareness of the transnational cinematic influences. So thank you, and that is my paper.
Thank you, Ted, for your interesting formal analysis and suggestions for further research on this topic. So sorry for this connection problem. And let's welcome Joan Hawkins, Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's the author of Cutting Edge, Art, Horror, and the Horrific Avant-Garde, and has written extensively on horror and experimental cinema. She's currently working on a book on indie horror. Her paper is called A Girl, a Knife, a Genre. Please, Joan, welcome.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Daniel and Wickham for organizing this conference, and Valerio for chairing the panel. They're great papers so far. And also, I need to explain that I was having some tech problems with my PowerPoint, so Daniel has very graciously volunteered to kind of take us through it. So as I'm saying, next slide, please, it's not just because I'm doing some sort of Duchampian power play. Okay, so this is very much a work in progress, and with some ideas that I'm still working out. So this is A Girl, a Knife, a Gun, sort of. So we could have the first slide. So this paper has taken something of a turn since I first proposed it several months ago. At that time, I had just taught an upper division undergraduate course on horror cinema. I didn't expect the students in that class to be familiar with horror studies, so I selected a very simple introductory text, this book, as the main textbook for the course, to be augmented with more complex and theoretical readings. The book was Studying Horror Cinema by Brian Turnock. Quote, aimed at teachers and students new to the subject, unquote, the book promised to provide the basic intro I thought the students would need. For the most part, the book satisfied my expectations. It followed a pretty traditional trajectory, dividing horror into historical eras, subgenre, and movements. My original idea for this paper grew out of the one anomalous chapter in that book, Chapter 9, the slasher film. Next slide. In that chapter, Turnock uses Mario Bava's Bay of Blood from 1964 as his slasher case study. In his recommended viewing list for the slasher chapter, he does list slasher classics like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Black Christmas, but also more jolly, Bava's Blood and Black Lace and Dario Argento's Deep Red. Turnock's logic of film selection then seems to collapse the slasher film with the Giallo, or at least insist that we read them side by side as adjacent genre. When I first proposed this paper for the Slasher Studies Conference, I wanted to interrogate the relationship between the slasher and the Giallo, basically to argue that while they may be adjacent horror genre, Turnock actually argues that Bay of Blood and the Giallo is a necessary precursor to the slasher, that while they may be adjacent, they are distinct, and they do different aesthetic and cultural work. I still plan to make that argument, but through a detour that changes the parameters a bit. So next slide, please. As I was working on this paper on slashers and gialli, I happened to watch Dakra, a 2019 Tunisian supernatural horror film with slasher elements. What surprised me about the film was the number of direct references to American and British slasher and supernatural slasher films, all within a rural Tunisian setting. And to be clear, Dakra is not really a slasher film. It's not invested in sexuality in the same way the slashers are, for one thing. Okay, but it cites them continually. So Carrie, Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, The Last House on the Left, The Omen, and Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, next slide, are just some of the films directly cited. Watching this film took me down something of a rabbit hole to consider the significance of recognizable slasher iconography within this North African context. It led me to consider the specific critical roots of slasher studies in anthropology and folklore, very different theoretical roots than Giallo studies. So this paper is less a comparison between genre, which is how it began, and more an attempt to raise some questions about the larger cultural work the slasher does and the teleology of slasher studies. It is perhaps a nod toward addressing the question, should we consider the slasher a separate genre, its own genre? And spoiler alert, I think we should. So Dakra is Abdelhamid Boushnak's debut film. It was initially released on the International Festival Circuit in 2019, screening in the US 2019 Overlook Film Festival. If you don't know it, it's sort of the Sundance of horror in the United States, at Fright Fest and at Venice. After that, it disappeared, at least in the United States. I tried to show it in a class, and even my students couldn't find it online. So it was recently picked up for commercial American distribution by Decalogue, and it's only now just coming out of the gray market into American theaters and on to the pricier streaming platforms like virtual cinemas, where rentals cost about $10 American. So in the US market, it's of the moment horror, and it was just recently recommended in a special July 23rd, 2021 horror article in the New York Times. Now, the film begins as journalism students Yasmin, Walid, and Bilal, as part of a classroom assignment, began investigating the case of Mangia. And the pun with the Italian Mangia is very telling. A woman who's been institutionalized for over 20 years. She'd been found wandering in the wild and has a reputation for extremely violent behavior in the asylum. She bit off an attendant's ear. When the students try to interview her in her special wing of the institution, think Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal Lecter, she attacks them, singling out Yasmin. When interviewing and filming Mangia becomes impossible, the students travel to the village where Mangia was found, a place very far removed in both geography and culture from modern sophisticated Tunis. Their car breaks down, they can't get a phone signal, so apparently trapped, they spend several days in a village where there is no running water. People believe in witchcraft, and the old ways still dominate. Women are veiled, and while they take meals communally with men, the women do not speak and they live separately. Most of their time seems to be taken up with domestic tasks, especially butchering, cleaning, preserving, and cooking the stringy, oddly flavored meat that appears at every meal. Within this basic framework, as I mentioned earlier, there are references to multiple slasher films. Even before starting the assignment, Yasmin had been troubled by nightmares of a woman in black. Now she dreams that while she is showering, that woman appears outside the stall, her figure blurred by the curtain, but clearly wielding a knife. The same night, Yasmin dreams that while she showers, blood begins flowing down her legs. She dreams of being taken from the care of an animal. Outside the somnambulist state, in the supposed diegetic real world, meal sequences are shot in ways reminiscent of the dinner scenes in Texas Chainsaw and The Last House on the Left. And Yasmin's story, which is revealed at the end of the film, is reminiscent of the adoption sequence in The Omen. Since much of this imagery occurs within dream sequences, the Anglo-American slasher becomes something like a cultural unconscious for this North African film, perhaps a commentary on the hegemony of American horror. Certainly, intertextuality can be read as a commercial consideration in this context, as a way to make the film more legible and therefore marketable to an international audience. But it also plays interestingly with the film's investment, both plot-wise and marketing-wise, in a certain anthropological stance. And this takes me back to a certain mode of slasher cinema that I want to consider. In terms of Dakra's plot, anthropology manifests pretty crudely. Once the students find themselves in the backward village, all attempts at interviewing subjects and getting a scoop fall to the wayside as they struggle to understand their primitive hosts and their weird ways and try to find a way to leave. In terms of marketing the film in the US, exoticism seems to be an equally crude anthropological selling point. Eric Piepenburg, writing for The Times, plays up the international strangeness of the film as a major attraction. Dakra is a fascinating international horror story, he writes. Thanks to its particular location, North Africa, its languages, Arabic and French, and a title card that says, in North Africa, hundreds of children are victims of acts of witchcraft, unquote. Its draw, then, is partly the class and backwoods phobia that Carol J. Clover argues drives films like Texas Chainsaw, Deliverance, Straw Dogs, and Wicker Man. But also, for critics like Piepenburg, the allure of the film is the way it enables a pre-ethnographic, freaky treasures, voyeuristic mode of anthropological study. Children fall victim to acts of witchcraft. And Daniel, could we get the trailer for Dakra? Great, thank you. Oops. Thank you. So as you can see, the cinematography for that film is just gorgeous. I said earlier that Dakra's investment in anthropology and folklore took me down the critical studies rabbit hole to an anthropological mode of slasher studies that I want to revisit. We have grown used to thinking slasher studies through the lens of chapter 1, Her Body Himself, and Carol J. Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Thanks. An essay that takes a fairly psychoanalytic approach to spectator identification with the final girl, and which lays out a taxonomy of horror plot devices and elements, the horrible place, the weapon, etc. For the purposes of this paper, I want to go back and consider the introduction of Men, Women, and Chainsaws. There, Clover argues for a more complex understanding of genre, one more akin to the understanding that anthropology has devised than we currently have in film studies. So in anthropology, genre takes the values of the ethnographer, the concerns of the intended audience, and what the producers of culture do and think into account, as well as laying out a taxonomy of plot elements and stylistic tropes. Number 2, so next slide, a folkloric view of tale types. And we should remember that Clover was a medievalist who specialized in Icelandic sagas before she started writing about slashers. And she was drawn to the slasher because it was so familiar to her from her Icelandic studies. And 3, most interesting, next slide, the argument that early social beliefs in a one-sex model of the body, gender, and sexuality, displaced, she argues, by the two-sex model that was developed in the 18th century, never really went away. So the one-sex model was that women's bodies were merely inverted versions of male bodies, not that, say, the penis and the vagina were cognate organs or related organs, but they were the same organ, just manifesting differently. One was an innie, one was an outie. that one-sex model that was displaced by taxonomies developed in the 18th century never really went away. That is, the one-sex view coexists in modern society with the more quote-unquote enlightened two-sex view, and it occasionally resurfaces in our cultural products. When I explain this to undergrad students, I use Usman's Black Girl, next slide, as an example. A film where past and present events seem to coexist seamlessly on the temporal and visual plane of the film. Here, the main character is dancing on a wall where the ancestors always, from which the ancestors always come. So that on first viewing, it's hard to understand some of the sequences because they belong to the past, but continually crop up unmarked in the present imaginary. In Clover's argument, the one-sex model of sexuality also coexists unmarked on the same plane as the two-sex model. And this, she argues, has an extreme impact on the way we view gender, structure policy, and make sense of the contemporary moment. Psychoanalytic, yes, but also very much indebted to new historicism and to the anthropological studies of scholars like Richard Bauman and Clifford Geertz, who argued that systems of meanings produce culture. For Clover, one place that the one-sex model continually resurfaces is the folklore of contemporary horror. And I want to stress here that she comes to horror through this notion of it being a kind of a folkloric genre, and she really does come to it through this anthropological lens. Particularly the slasher film, where it seems to live on as both a psychoanalytic and anthropological artifact, so much a part of our emotional DNA that we don't recognize it. Her body, himself. On the one hand, this has a decidedly psychoanalytic aspect. Both Freud and Jung believe that we carry certain narrative structures within our psyche, Oedipus, to take but one example, that structure our individual psychosexual development. But as much as Clover is interested in the identification of appeal of a character like the final girl to adolescent male viewers in a kind of psychoanalytic way, she's also interested in the larger cultural elements of these tales, their anthropological mode, if you will. Approaching the intertextual slasher references in Dakra, all of which come from the period Clover describes, and Dakra being a film heavily invested in modes and methods of anthropology and in the horror that ensues when you get it wrong, that all made me want to go back to reconsider the anthropological aspects of early slasher films and to read that against the Gothic and the Giallo. So a major focus of my argument is that first wave slashers are invested in the anthropological in a way that I don't think Gialli are, and encourage a certain anthropological mode of viewing in a way that Gialli do not. This anthropological mode is most obvious when people from the city go into the backwoods and encounter alien cultures, Texas Chainsaw. Here, the film's trajectory is one of entering, penetrating, and finding the heart of darkness. But the anthropological is also present in first-wave suburban horror, films like Halloween or Stepfather. Okay, next slide. The stalker films that Veridika argues begin with a past crime and then plunges into that crime's continued reverberation in the present. One of the things that is notable about these films is the way they open within the crime. This is the first sequence from Stepfather. And then pull out to reveal a nice middle-class neighborhood. The initial impact generally is calling attention to the dichotomy, interpolating us as good bourgeois. How could such a horrible thing happen in Ward and June Cleaver suburb land? But as these films unfold, what begins to happen is that the suburbs themselves become strange. It's no longer how could this happen in happy suburbia, but more what really goes on behind those closed doors. What kind of domestic abuse? What kind of terror? The move of first-wave suburban slashers is to render suburbia the most normative of white normal, strange and freaky. Sometimes haunted by spirits whose graves have been displaced, but always places so obsessed with insular family dramas that a babysitter whom everyone knows can run to a house and scream for help only to have the inhabitants turn out the lights, that famous scene in Halloween where Laurie's trying to get help. Where a man who looks normal, like this guy, can marry and blend right in until it's time to dissolve the family and move on to the next suburb. The suburb becoming here the perfect place for a serial killer, a slasher to hide, thrive even in plain sight. Next slide. Michael's uncanny appearance and disappearances in Halloween being a case in point. To be clear, I'm not arguing that Bushnach used intertextuality in Dakra in order to call attention to the anthropological mode that runs throughout so much first-wave Anglo-American slasher cinema. But the fact that he uses this intertextuality within the context of a film that itself encourages a certain anthropological fascination encouraged me to look at slashers through a slightly different lens than I'm used to, sort of the way the original thematic structure of the Tate Modern encouraged us to look differently at art we thought we knew well. Emerging with a vengeance in the 1970s and rising to prominence in the Reagan-Thatcher years, the early slasher is a subversive genre, one that encourages us to look at the culture we have created and promoted anthropologically, and see a landscape full of bizarre natives whose freaky cultural ways beg analysis. Jordan Peele's Get Out may be a singularly dramatic example of othering white suburbia and making it strange, but it is not the first film to do so. My fellow panelists have discussed some of the overlaps between giallo and slashers and the giallo's influence on the slasher, and I don't disagree with them. I'm a big fan of both and scholarship. But following my earlier discussion, I'd like to suggest a couple of differences. Gialli are much more indebted to the insular aspects of the Gothic than Anglo-American slashers are, much more about obsessions, fetishes, and sublimated desire than about mere repetition compulsion. Carol Tohill and Pete Tomes link all continental horror of the late 1950s to 1970s to the fantastique and the erotic thriller tradition. And while the urban and urbane spaces of gialli also enable crime, murder, and violence, the spaces themselves, the cities, the neighborhoods, are rarely subjected to any kind of anthropological gaze, a Marxist gaze perhaps. But it seems that all early post-World War II European cinema operates differently than its American counterpart in this way. Europe was so destroyed by World War II, there's a certain wonder in French, German, and Italian films at the degree to which survival and economic recovery was possible. The recent remake of Suspiria, I think, plays with that, turning the witch's coven and the school into a site of the resistance. Continental films of this period take a kind of fantasy look at the bourgeois lifestyle, the fantastic student apartment that Susie temporarily occupies while her room at the school is being readied in Argento's Suspiria, for example, is a clear case in point. It's sort of an affectionate nod to white telephone movies. So a fantasy look at the bourgeois lifestyle, even as it's being critiqued, that's very different, I think, from the anthropological gaze I've been describing for the slasher. Even in supernatural films like Argento's Suspiria, our critical attention is less focused on the school or Freiburg than it is on punitive pedagogy, Susie dancing until she collapses, and on Helena Marcos. The problem for me then in collapsing slashers and gialli in academic discourse is not just that there are no black gloves or sophisticated women in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also that the classic gialli of Mario Bava and Dario Argento operate on a different socio-historic plane and are refracted through a different lens. Last slide. One more link to Sade, Gramsci, and the Gothic, and less to Margaret Mead. It's not just the slashing that makes for a slasher. I'm going to end here so there's time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Analytical and theoretical reflections. And so let's get back to Émilie. Hopefully now we'll be able to talk and the connection will be okay.
Yes, hello again from a different room. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn off my camera just for the sake of connection, and fingers crossed that this time is good. All right, so happy to be back again to present. All right, so let's begin. Dario Argento's 1985 film Phenomena opens on an empty, windy road in the Swiss Alps, where a group of tourists emerging from the woods are picked up by a bus. As it drives off into the distance, a young woman runs behind, yelling and gesturing for it to stop. She has been left behind. The camera then surveys the dense forest in all of its austere immensity, carefully climbing up the coniferous trees and seemingly swayed by the same wind that animates the forest as the credit sequence plays on. The very subtle movement of the camera, almost mimicking that of the trees being blown by an eerily loud wind, creates a sense of unsettledness. The following shot confirms the serene yet oddly sinister tone of its location. Embedded in the mountainous landscape and grassy meadow sits a house surrounded by luscious trees. After a brief close-up, the camera returns to the young woman, now cold and all alone on the empty road. She begins to run down a gravel path towards a secluded home. The camera shifts perspectives, moving from looking at her from outside to inside the home. It has entered before she ever does. A brief glimpse reveals chains attached to a wall being yanked, alluding to an unknown danger lurking from within. Looking for help, the young tourist enters the house and cautiously walks further in, calling out loudly. She is a lost foreigner, she explains, as the chains tug from the walls with increasing violence. The camera accompanies her from room to room as she slowly walks through the home looking for help. Suddenly, the young woman is violently attacked from behind with presumably the same chains that were restricting a mysterious creature just a few moments earlier. She manages to escape her attacker and races to a door where she is stabbed through the hand with a pair of scissors. She runs out of the house and darts into the forest, walking past a river and following a tourist trail until she finds herself into a set of cavernous caves and tunnels. Chased by her assailant to a window lookout, a dead end, she is stabbed through the heart and smashes through a pane of glass, a trademark of the director, in slow motion as the waterfall rushes behind her. This character, like many of the victims in his films, is a gateway into the nightmarish worlds of Dario Argento, where both landscape and architectures are complicit in the violence that is unleashed on screen. As she immerses herself into her environment, the young woman acts as a guide, tracing the boundaries between real and imagined spaces of horror. Upon her death, the camera's eye begins to once again carefully study the environment, moving through the various bodies of water and waterfalls, creeping towards the gushing water while carefully moving against spillway rocks and boulders. An ecology is established, or perhaps re-established. From the opening crane shot studying the isolated alpine landscape with its dark towering trees and imposing mountains to the dazzling camera works of the first brutal assault, the first kill, Argento's investment in world making is clear. Through visual experimentation, he establishes a unique spatial practice in cinematic gaze. The ideological function of architecture in the cinema of Argento already articulates an expanded understanding of the human, shown in his rejection of the stability of the gaze in architecture. The camera surveys the boundaries between real and imagined, body and architecture, human and non-human. That the vivarium, a glass cage, became a recurring object in the cinema of Argento is notable. The vivarium is an architectural structure made of glass, a material often used to pierce, slash, or sever the body in Argento's films, and whose function is to both exhibit and contain life forms. Carl Schoonover writes that the, quote, imagery in Argento is ecological, if by ecology we mean the study of the interplay of organisms, things, and the world, or, as the Garzani dictionary puts it, the science that studies the relation between living beings and the surroundings in which they live. Phenomena belongs to an ecological Italian cinema, and despite not being a direct predecessor to the slasher, like the other films that we will discuss today, it is nonetheless symptomatic of similar concerns. The Italian proto-slashers that inspired the film, and a plethora of others, embody a certain post-human hybridity. And I'm indebted here in this reading to Elena Past, who identifies in her book, Italian Eco-Cinema Beyond the Human, what she terms a post-human hybridity, post-war Italian cinema. This has led me to reconsider Giallo films through an eco-critical lens and investigate the ways in which the post-human turn in the humanities might offer new readings of this constellation of Italian films and their successors. In the second act of Phenomena, we are introduced to the film's protagonist, Jennifer Cornevo, as she arrives to the same Swiss town to attend an exclusive boarding school for girls. During her first night at the school, she has a nightmare about a young woman being chased through the woods. This young woman runs to a barricaded house where she is subsequently violently attacked. It is at this moment that Jennifer, rising from her bed, begins sleepwalking. After being awoken by witnessing the murder, she begins to wander into the small town. Due to her impaired vision, she's nearly hit by a car driven by two men who then abduct her. Jennifer fights them off and escapes by jumping out of the moving car. She lands into the wood where, sitting on the ground and lit by moonlight, she is framed by luscious green leaves, seemingly becoming a woodland creature herself. Scared and alone, she notices two ladybugs on a leaf. The camera offers a brief close-up of the insects before a chimpanzee then finds Jennifer and extends his hand before guiding her away. The camera then shifts to a fractured shot, organized and regimented image, repeated in succession, showing the repetitive perspective of the insects as they watch her leave. Later on, when Jennifer emerges from yet another sleepwalking state, she goes out to find her roommate who has then disappeared. Led by a firefly, she finds it what she presumes to be the killer's black glove. Back in her room, she studies the glove carefully, and upon putting it on, she realizes that it is filled with maggots. Rather than disgust, Jennifer responds with fascination to the maggots now covering her hand. As she gazes down at her fingers, she focuses on a small maggot under her fingernail. The next shot, an extreme close-up of the larva, is followed by two rapid shots of the previous murder, that of her roommate, from the perspective of the insect. Despite its brevity, I argue that this moment is significant. We see here a repetition of the fragmentation seen previously via the gaze of the ladybugs, despite not being from the same insect. The telepathic communication with the insects is shown through extreme close-up of eyes, rarefying a gaze as a point of multi-species connection in Argento. And unfortunately, I'm not going to try the clips, but here we have the two shots that I am referring to. These sequences, which focus on the gaze, or rather the perspective of the insects, highlight a key aspect of Argento's filmmaking, but also of an Italian horror cinema concerned by the increasingly unstable category of the human in the post-war period, marked by the rise of cybernetics and the Cold War nuclear threat. The shifting dynamics at the heart of shifting are noteworthy. From the gaze of the killer to the gaze of the victim to an all-knowing gaze, this process is further complicated here by the additional gaze of the insects. By doing so, Argento gestures to yet another porous boundary, that of who, or perhaps what, constitutes the subject. The insects are given serious consideration. They have power and agency. They're not controlled by Jennifer, but rather come to her aid based on a shared affinity, a point of relation, of connection. In addition, the composition of the shots highlights a desire to decenter the human gaze, to provide what I argue is a moment of resistance to anthropocentrism, unseated here by a moment critically located at the intersection of mimesis and hybridity. It is also one, I argue, that is rooted in the tradition of Italian horror, from which we can trace the formation of a gaze that has influenced the American slasher film cycle. One that not only rubs against gendered processes of identification and their associated sadistic and masochistic pleasures, see Mulvey, Clovey, Creed, and Williams, but also disrupts the understanding of this gaze as human. I argue that there exists within the Italian horror and giallo cinemas that inspired the slasher cycle early articulations of hybridity and post-human sensibilities, both tied to specific implementations of the gaze, embracing the inherent contradiction that arises between understanding the human as both originator and originated in cinema. I propose the concept of the hybrid gaze, a gaze that threatens our understanding of the human itself. The hybrid gaze establishes the parameters for an ecology in which the physical surroundings and objects reveal the instability of the human rather than its supremacy. That the human suddenly emerges as a question rather than a fact in these brief moments, for me reveals deep-seated anxieties that can be traced back to a time marked by intergenerational trauma stemming from the Second World War and its devastation, increasing political instability, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and much more, which we will return to later. Phenomena heavily borrows from Mario Bava's Ecologia del Diletto, an iconic proto-slasher and an inspiration for the genre, serving as the blueprint for Friday the 13th. The title of the film translates to Ecology of Crime, although the film was released as A Bay of Blood, one of its many titles. From thematic concerns like ecology, entomology, and an emphasis on an anti-anthropomorphic gaze to the film practices of both directors, we can begin to trace a resonance between A Bay of Blood and Phenomena. A Bay of Blood begins with a subtle point of view shot from the perspective of an insect navigating the landscape upon which violence will soon unfold. This is indicated by the coupling of a frenzied camera and a buzzing sound. Throughout the film, Bava's camera remains insect-like, surveying landscapes and spaces in disorienting fashion. The film features an early example of point of view shots and of non-human perspectives. On POV shots, Michael J. Coven writes in his excellent study of the Giallo La Dolce Morte that, quote, "The first and most notable visual cinematic device in the Giallo is the point of view, or POV shot, wherein the camera takes the perspective of one of the characters, most often the killer stalking the victim. This highly artificial device, which immediately ruptures the classical text and calls attention to its own constructedness, has become highly cliched in the wake of the slasher film that followed the Giallo," unquote. That this coincides with a desire to decenter the human gaze is for me not a coincidence. While the emphasis is usually placed on technology, with tools such as cameras and binoculars enabling the point of view, the animalistic quality of the POV shots shouldn't be discounted. As Juicy Parika writes in Insect Media, quote, "If you approach entomology as media theory, it reveals a whole new world of sensations, perceptions, movements, stratagems, and patterns of organization that work much beyond the confines of the human world," unquote. This interconnectedness of biology and technology raises interesting questions about the use of insect POV shots in these films, about the relationship between the insect gaze and the eye of the camera. Throughout A Bay of Blood, nature enables stalking and violence. Despite its ability to conceal, it is also reflective, like glass and mirrors that we see throughout Bava's film. The film also presents insects that are observed, studied, captured, and contained, caged in glass containers, drawing parallels between the insects and the victims trapped in the landscape of the bay at the center of the narrative, its ecology, its ecosystems. The vivarium emerges again, although more subtly, probing the liminality of cinema by returning the gaze through its insistence on capturing and displaying. While Sergio Martino's I corpi presentano tracce di violenza carnale, or Torso, has most often been referred to as the quintessential proto-slasher, as Coven, among many others, points out, I would argue that it is Bava's A Bay of Blood and its outright denial of Giallo conventions, despite a brief moment during the film's first kill, that is most explicitly an ancestor to the American slasher, setting up a gaze that is threatening both within the diegesis and outside. Torso actually reprises key aspects of Bava's film, namely the use of POV shots filtered through objects such as binoculars or cameras, objectifying victims. Torso also interestingly emphasizes cage motifs reminiscent of Argento's filmmaking, most poignantly at the end of the film, that is often referred to as the cat and mouse sequence. A departure from the vivarium, the cage signals a different kind of entrapment, one less focused on the spectacle and more on containment in its horrors. Despite an all-too-human killer, the POV shots in the film feature impossible point of views, ambiguous gazes, and the violent transgression of boundaries that extend beyond the possibilities afforded by the human body. Argento, however, returns to the human animal, allowing animalistic qualities to re-emerge. Taking Italian horror cinema and the Giallo to their next logical step, Argento's world is imbued with animism, whereby everything is in relation, alive and communicating. The world is one where, quote, all social and ontological boundaries are porous and can be crossed over under specific circumstances. A world of becomings and metamorphoses in which entity precedes the set of relation that brings it into being, unquote, which I borrow from Karen Kramer's formulation of animism. Argento embraces objectification and extends his investment in the breaking of boundaries between people and things to the body itself. Even the eye, originator of the gaze, becomes an object to attack. Expanding the gaze to move beyond the anthropomorphic is no longer enough. The gaze itself must be destroyed. Animality is no longer a quality, it is an imperative. Central to Argento's ecology is mimesis, or what Roberto Marchesini refers to as, quote, the quality that characterizes the human as hybrid, unquote. Through the gaze and through architecture, the ecosystem, Argento imbues objects and non-human actors with animism, whereby non-embodied things have an embodiment, a cinematic presence, further troubling the human-non-human divide. In the larva and ladybug point of view scenes, the image is broken up, fractured. There is no wholeness. Argento must break the image itself. From Bava to Martino to Argento, we can trace an evolution of the gaze, an increasingly infectious and infecting environment of ecologies and ecosystems, and of the human with which these aspects are in constant relation. While Adam Charles Hart relates the point of view shots in Italian Gialli to a narrative device to enhance mystery by enabling the viewer to witness violence without revealing the murder's identity, I argue that a web of relationalities is formed through both the ecology of the image and repeated encounters with the hybrid gaze, which in turn leads to the creation of an ecology that facilitates a post-human hybridity within these films. When phenomena culminates in the reveal of a disfigured and deformed child killer, presented as a biological anomaly, it gestures to an important thematic aspect, a concern in Argento cinema, namely his obsessive return to infancy, to the split, to the failure of the hybrid. Jennifer, too, is hybrid. She is not entirely human. And it is this hybrid that is abject, lacking defined boundaries and threatening a breakdown in meaning caused by, as Dino Fallujah explained, the, quote, loss of distinction between subject and object, between self and other, unquote. Like the corpse, the hybrid literalizes the breakdown between subject and object. Jennifer, however, represents a successful amalgamation of human and non-human. She is post-human. She enables the contemplation of possibilities afforded by the other than human, the unhuman, the post-human, that Italian horror cinema has long been fascinated by. As Mikhail Kovin remarks in La Dolce Morte, quote, the real past trauma being exercised within the Giallo is a historical one, the defeat and emasculation of Italy in the war under fascism, unquote. A trauma, he points out, that has been haunting Italians ever since, and that may be summed up, for me, by Primo Levi's amazement by the, quote, men's inhumanity to men. This focus enables a consideration of the ways in which the evolution of the gaze is reflective of the context within which it emerged. This period of Italian genre cinema created an innovative new mode of viewing and showing horror, one that triggers deep-seated anxieties and also questions our own humanity. The crisis of embodiment within these films, as well as a variegated investment in the representation of otherness, further complicated by the decentering of the human via the hybrid gaze, is indicative of what Rosi Braidotti refers to as the, quote, post-anthropomorphism turn in popular culture. The rise of the mutable post-human assemblages presenting themselves as androids, aliens, and techno-monstrous others betray an investment in pre-digital forms of embodiment. As our own bodily boundaries become increasingly blurred, the exploration of the lived body's previous limitations is powerfully articulated in film and moving image media, as the ascension of the post-human keeps expanding how and what we conceive to be human, and yet rarely have these considerations being traced back to or extended to the Giallo film and Italian horror cinema. By mapping the post-human and its representation in popular culture, Elaine Graham significantly rejects the conventions of post-human and proposes the term post/human, instead as to suggest, quote, a questioning of both the inevitability of a successor species and there being any consensus surrounding the effects of technology on the future of humanity, unquote. As such, the post/human should be thought of as, quote, that which both confounds but also holds up to scrutiny the terms on which the quintessentially human will be conceived, unquote. The boundaries between human and other than human have often found their most powerful, albeit problematic, articulation through the discourse of monstrosity. The hybrid has long been conceived as monstrous. The monster is not only embodied otherness, it also represents more modes of enforcement and transgressions made flesh. And if there's something that the Giallo and the slasher love, it is flesh. The Italian proto-slasher films enabled the proliferation of a hybrid gaze that moved beyond the other than human and non-human quality gaze tied to monstrosity of difference, contemplating instead a complete loss of humanity and its consequences. By collapsing murderous gazes and POV cinematography and the gazes of non-human actors, the Italian proto-slasher and its successors examined the human's inhumanity or unhumanity and probes its consequences. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Émilie, for this rich and stimulating paper. We have a question from Don Keatley. Writes, I love this emphasis on the insect's point of view. Connection to bees in Candyman? Would you like to answer?
That's a really interesting question. You cut out right at the beginning as you started to read the question, but I don't know that I've noticed the perspective of the bees specifically in Candyman, but I do think that there is such an interesting overlap between this creation of an ecology within the urban setting, because I think something that really stands out in the Gialli and proto-slashers that I focused on is that the ecological aspects of it is quite obvious. And so I think the question regarding Candyman actually brings up interesting questions about the ecology of an urban space and how that might reframe the dynamics around the gaze. And I think the racial politics at the center of the film also would very much informed, I think, how I would perceive this question of hybridity.
There is another question for you, Émilie, by Moth in Head. Do you believe Argento's insect gaze could be trying to say something objective about what we are seeing, or is he maybe attempting to distance himself from an analysis of human gaze? While Steve Jones asks, has anything been written on Jaws as a proto-slasher?
So not necessarily as a proto-slasher in regards to Jaws, but the point of view perspective from a non-human entity definitely brings to mind the film, as we can see the perspective of the shark throughout the film. Adam Charles Hart actually talks about this in a piece that I would be happy to share. As far as the first question regarding Argento, I think there is, I'm not sure about perhaps the question of faithfulness to the image or the lack of objectivity when decentering the gaze, but I think there's something interesting in terms of tapping into our own animality and perhaps presenting a gaze that is still somewhat human because of our entanglements with the animal world. So using the non-human gaze and non-human perspective to sort of allude to our own animality and our own inability to perhaps be objective or to have any objectivity. So I think the human gaze is still very much key. It's the parallel between the two, the comparing and contrasting that happens within these moments that are so revelatory for me.
We still have 6 minutes for questions and answers. I would like to ask you, specifically Émilie and Ted, if you have any reflections on how we can expound this issue of point of view and embodiment using a neurocognitive approach, which is something that I find particularly stimulating. I'm thinking about some research that is taking place here in Italy by neurologist Vittorio Gallese and Michele Guerra about the neurophysiological underpinnings of empathy and our embodied experience of films and audiovisual media. Do you have any reflections to share? Have you ever thought about this kind of approach?
I'm going to let Ted answer because I feel like I've been speaking nonstop, but I can't say that I have, but I think something that I've been reflecting on a lot and working on this presentation is the ways in which a lot of the aspects when it comes to hybridity in Argento is on one hand quite problematic, thinking about otherness and difference as sites of horror, but then also seeing it as sort of a promising aspect of the filmmaking, something to explore that's not necessarily negative or horrifying in a way that's inherently bad. And I think your question brings up some more expensive ways of reimagining these moments and thinking about, again, the possibilities afforded by what they present within the film.
I can't say that I've, just to your question, I can't say that I've thought specifically on that. But one thing that I've definitely considered that I sort of touch on in my paper here, but in other research I've done a little more work on, and it's sort of a work in progress that I'm looking to dive more into. But the idea of the sort of multi-sensory nature of particularly Argento's work, and how the sort of empathetic and sympathetic entry through the camera's ocular lens, but supplemented by the audio, and even like the audio for sure, but also the tactility of film. I'm thinking of Jennifer Barker's book, The Tactile Eye, where she describes ways that film can touch, and film can like touch the viewer, and it's in a sort of abstract way, and that film has a sort of body and gesture and behaviors, and so I'm interested in kind of analyzing sort of the I guess the behaviors, so to speak, of the Giallo and Argento's filmmaking, and how it's sort of gestures using different sensory approaches towards creating kind of a heightened empathetic, sympathetic association between viewer on screen and the on-screen subjects, more specifically victim and assailant.